I want to tell you about the afternoon my phone rang and the caller identified himself as a senior partner at Hartwell and Associates, one of the three largest litigation firms in Atlanta, Georgia, and told me that he was representing my sister's company in a federal dispute and that I was the only expert in the country whose specific credentials could help them. He did not know I was her sister. She did not know he was calling me. I want to start where this story actually starts, which is not in a law office or on a phone call. It starts in a kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, when I was 24 years old and told my family I had been accepted to a doctoral program in forensic accounting at Georgia Tech. My sister, Melissa, is 3 years older than me. She had built by 27 the kind of early career that generates a specific kind of family confidence. She was a marketing director at a mid-sized consumer goods company. She was making good money. She had a clear and visible trajectory. She was the one who had figured things out in the way that our family recognized and valued. She had opinions about my PhD. She said, "Forensic accounting, what does that even mean?" I said, "It's the intersection of accounting, auditing, and investigative analysis. It's used in litigation, in fraud detection, and regulatory compliance." She said, "So you're going to be an accountant?" I said, "A forensic accountant. It's a specific subspecialty." She said, "And you need a PhD for that." I said, "I need a PhD to do the research and the expert witness work that I want to do." She said, "Expert witness?" I said, "Yes, in litigation. When a case involves complex financial analysis, courts need experts who can explain it to a jury." She said, "So you're going to spend 5 years getting a PhD so you can explain accounting to juries?" I said, "That's one way to describe it." She said, "Caroline, you could have a real career with your accounting degree. You don't need to spend 5 years on a PhD that no one is going to understand." I said, "I understand it." She said, "You know what I mean." She meant that the path I was choosing was not visible in the ways that mattered to her framework. It did not have the clear corporate trajectory, the recognizable job title, the salary progression that she could track and evaluate. It was a path into a specialized academic and professional world that she had no experience with and no interest in understanding. She said, "It seems pointless." I said, "To you," she said, "to most people." I said, "I'm not doing it for most people." She said, "You're going to spend 5 years in school and come out the other side with a title that nobody knows what to do with." I said, "Some people will know what to do with it." She said, "Who?" I said, "Lawyers mostly." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Well, it's your life, it's your life." The phrase that families use when they have expressed their opinion and are now withdrawing from engagement while maintaining the right to say they told you so. I went to Georgia Tech. I want to walk through the 7 years that followed because the details matter to the phone call. The PhD program in forensic accounting at Georgia Tech was 5 years of work that I cannot describe adequately in summary, because the summary loses the texture of what it actually was. The specific intellectual pleasure of building expertise in a domain that sits at the intersection of multiple disciplines. The research into financial fraud patterns that became my dissertation. The network of faculty and practitioners and legal professionals that a serious doctoral probe. I defended my dissertation at 29 on the financial signature patterns of sophisticated corporate fraud schemes, the specific ways that large-scale financial manipulation leaves traces in transaction data that standard audit procedures do not detect but that forensic analysis can identify. My committee described it as the most significant contribution to the field in 5 years. Melissa said, "Congratulations. So what do you do now?" I said, And I'm building my expert witness practice." She said, "Expert witness?" I said, "Yes, litigation support. When companies or individuals face federal fraud investigations or civil litigation involving complex financial analysis, their attorneys hire experts to analyze the evidence and testify." She said, "And people pay for that." I said, "Very well." She said, "How well?" I said, "Well enough." I did not tell her the specific numbers because the specific numbers would have produced a different conversation than the one I wanted to have. I had learned, by 29, to manage what information I shared with Melissa about my career, because the information consistently produced either dismissal or a recalibration of her interest that I did not want. My expert witness practice grew over the following 7 years in the specific way that practices in specialized fields grow, through reputation, through the quality of the work, through the network of attorneys who hired me once and hired me again and referred me to colleagues. By 35, I had testified in 47 federal cases. I had been retained by the Department of Justice on 3 occasions as a consulting expert. I had published 31 peer-reviewed articles in forensic accounting and related journals. I had been named by 2 different legal publications as one of the top forensic accounting experts in the southeastern United States. Melissa knew approximately none of this, not because I was hiding it, because she had stopped asking. The "what do you do now" of 29 had been answered with enough information for her to file my career under complicated academic thing that seems to be working out okay, and she had filed it there and moved on. We had a functional relationship. We talked at family occasions and occasionally between them. She had married a man named Greg who ran a logistics company. They had 2 children who I adored, and the surface of our relationship was warm and uncomplicated. The professional dimension of my life simply did not feature in it. Her company was called Meridian Consumer Products. It was a mid-sized consumer goods company. She had been there for 15 years, had risen to vice president of marketing, and had become, in the years since her early success had placed her on the trajectory she had always planned, someone whose professional confidence was closely tied to the institution she had built her career within. The federal investigation began, as these things do, with a subpoena. I did not know about the investigation when it started. Melissa did not tell me, partly because she did not understand its significance initially and partly because our relationship did not include the sharing of professional difficulties any more than it included the sharing of professional successes. What I knew was what the public record eventually reflected, that Meridian Consumer Products had been named as a defendant in a civil action brought by a competitor alleging trade secret misappropriation and fraudulent financial reporting. The allegations were specific and serious, that Meridian had obtained proprietary pricing algorithms through improper means, and had subsequently manipulated its financial reporting to conceal the competitive advantage the algorithm. It was, in the specific language of my field, exactly the kind of case that required a forensic accounting expert with expertise in both financial statement fraud and algorithmic pricing analysis. There were approximately 4 people in the country who had published research in both of those specific areas simultaneously. I was one of them. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The caller identified himself as Richard Hartwell, senior partner at Heir. He said he was representing the defendant in a significant federal civil matter, and that the case required a forensic accounting expert with specific credentials in financial statement analysis and algorithmic pricing. He said he had reviewed the published literature in the field and identified 4 potential experts. He said he was calling me first because my work most closely matched the specific technical requirements of the case. He said, "Dr. Webb, I'd like to discuss whether you'd be available to serve as our expert witness." I said, "I'd be glad to discuss it. Can you tell me the name of your client?" He said, "Meridian Consumer Products." I said, "I see." He said, "Are you familiar with the matter?" I said, "I am. I should disclose something before we go further." He said, "Of course." I said, "The vice president of marketing at Meridian Consumer Products is my sister." There was a pause. He said, "Your sister?" I said, "No. She's been with the company for 15 years. There was a longer pause. He said, "Dr. Webb, I was not aware of that connection." I said, "I understand. It creates a potential conflict of interest that you need to evaluate before we proceed." He said, "Yes. Can I ask, do you have any financial relationship with Meridian or with your sister that would affect your ability to provide objective analysis?" I said, "No. My sister and I have a personal relationship but no prof." He said, "And your analysis would be based entirely on the evidence and the methodology." I said, "My analysis is always based entirely on the evidence and the methodology. That's what forensic accounting is." He said, "I need to discuss this with my client before we proceed." I said, "Of course." He said, "Dr. Webb, I want to be direct with you about something." I said, "Please." He said, "I reviewed your publication record and your testimony history before I called. You are the most qualified expert I have identified for this specific matter. The other 3 candidates have partial overlap with what we need. You have complete overlap. If the familial connection can be managed appropriately, I would like to retain you." I said, "I appreciate that. I'll wait to hear from you." He called back the following morning. He said, "I spoke with the executive team at Meridian. They were unaware of the connection. They are comfortable proceeding if you are." He said, "Your sister was apparently surprised." I said, "I imagine she was. Melissa called me approximately 40 minutes after Richard Hartwell's second call. I want to describe that conversation carefully because it is the center of the story." She said, "Richard Hartwell called me." I said, "I know." She said, "He told me you're the expert he wants to retain." I said, "Yes." She said, "For our case?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You're a forensic accounting expert." I said, "Yes." She said, "Who testifies in federal cases?" I said, 47 of them so far." She was quiet. She said, 47. I said, "Yes." She said, "And you're Richard Hartwell said you're one of the 4 most qualified people in the country for what our case needs." I said, "That's his assessment." She said, "And you publish research?" I said, 31 article. She said, 31. I said, "Yes." She said, "Caroline?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I said your PhD was pointless." I said. She said, "I said you were going to spend 5 years getting a degree that nobody knew what to do with." I said, "Yes." She said, "And lawyers know what to do with it." I said, "Yes. Lawyers very much know what to do with it." She said, "And right now my lawyer is calling you because you're one of 4 people in the country who can help us." I said, "Yes." She said, "And the other 3 are less qualified." I said, "That's Richard's assessment, not mine. But he's a very good attorney and his assessments are generally sound." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "How much does this kind of work pay?" I said, "I told you it paid well. It pays very well." She said, "How well?" I said, "Do you actually want to know the number?" She said, "Yes." I told her. She was quiet for a longer moment than before. She said, "Per case?" I said, "Per engagement. Some cases are longer than others." She said, "And you've done 47. I said, "Yes." I said, "It was pointless." I said, "Yes." She said, "I said nobody would know what to do with your degree." I said, "Lawyers know what to do with it, and federal investigator, and the Department of Justice, which retained me 3 times, and the 31 journals that published my research, and the 2 legal publications that named me one of the top experts in the southeastern United States." I said, "Quite a few people know what to do with it." She said, "I didn't know any of that." I said, you never asked. She was quiet. She said, I should have asked. I said, yes. She said, I was dismissive when you were 24 and I never revisited it. I said, no, you didn't. She said, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, when you said that some people would know what to do with your degree, and I asked who, and you said lawyers mostly. I said, yes. She said, did you know then that this was where you were going? I said, I knew the field had significant demand from the legal system. I knew my research area was one that litigation would need. I didn't know the specifics of how it would develop. She said, but you knew it wasn't pointless. I said, I always knew it wasn't pointless. She said, and I said it was. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. She said, Caroline, will you take the case? I said, yes. Provided the conflict of interest is managed appropriately and I'm retained through the standard process. She said, Richard said the same thing. He said, you were very correct about the process. I said, the process mattered. If I'm going to testify, my analysis has to be unimpeachable. That means the retention has to be standard. She said, even though I'm your sister. I said, especially because you're my sister. Any appearance of bias would undermine the testimony. The process protects both of us. She said, Richard said you said something like that on the phone. I said, it's what the work requires. She said, you're very serious about this. I said, I've been serious about it for 13 years. I know it hasn't always been visible from where you were standing. She said, no, it hasn't. She said, I want to understand it, the work. What you actually do. I said, I'll tell you after the case. While the case is active, it's better if we keep professional and personal separate. She said, after the case. I said, yes. She said, I'll hold you to that. I said, I know you will. The case took 11 months. I am not going to describe the specifics of the matter because some of it is covered by confidentiality provisions and because the specific technical details of a federal financial fraud case are not what this story is about. What I will say is that my analysis was thorough, that my testimony was admitted by the court without challenge, and that the outcome of the case was favorable to Melissa's company in the ways that mattered most. Richard Hartwell called me after the verdict. He said, Dr. Webb, I want to tell you that your testimony was the most effective expert witness testimony I have seen in 30 years of litigation. I said, I appreciate that. He said, I also want to tell you that I have referred you to 3 colleagues who have matters that may require your expertise. I said, thank you. He said, one more thing. I said, yes. He said, your sister came to me after the verdict. She asked me what it meant that you were one of 4 people in the country who could do what you did for our case. I said, what did you tell her? He said, I told her it meant that her sister had spent 13 years building something that most people, including most lawyers, didn't fully understand until they needed it. He said she knew. I said, yes, she does now. The dinner was 3 weeks after the verdict. Melissa organized it, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant in Atlanta that she chose because it was the kind of place that serious conversations happen without being the kind of place where they feel forced. She had prepared, I could tell. She had the specific quality of someone who has done their research and is bringing it to a conversation. She said, I looked you up after the case ended. Properly. I said, what did you find? She said, 31 articles, 47 cases, 2 DOJ engagement, the legal publication, the citations and other people's research. She said, I looked at the citations. Other researchers are building on your work. I said, yes, that's what She said, I didn't know that's what academic research produced. I said, most people don't, unless they're in it. She said, I said it was pointless. I said, you said it at 27 with the information you had. She said, I said it like I knew, like I had evaluated the field and determined it had no value. I said, yes. She said, I hadn't evaluated anything. I had looked at the title and decided. I said, yes. She said, that's arrogant. I said, it's common. People do it with specialized fields they don't understand. She said, I did it to my sister's career. I said, yes. She said, for 13 years. I said, yes. She said, and then my company needed you. I said, yes. She said, and Richard Hartwell called you because you were the most qualified person he could find. I said, yes. She said, and you took the case. I said, yes. She said, why? I said, because it was the right case for my expertise and the conflict of interest. And because you're my sister. She said, even though I said it was pointless. I said, yes. She said, I don't deserve that. I said, probably not, but you're my sister. That's not always about what people deserve. She said, Caroline. I said, yes. She said, I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. I'm saying it now because I mean it and because I understand now, actually understand what you built and what it took and what it means. She said, and because my company would have lost a federal case without you, and that tends to clarify things. I laughed, she laughed too. We finished dinner. I am 37 years old. I have a forensic accounting practice that is, by any measure I can apply, exactly what I told my sister it would be when I was 24. She said it was pointless. Her company's lawyer called me because I was one of 4 people in the country who could help her. She looked me up afterward. She found 31 articles and 47 cases and 2 DOJ engagements and citations in other people's research. She said she was proud. She said it directly in words at a restaurant in Atlanta 3 weeks after a verdict that my testimony had helped produce. That is the complete shape of this story, not dramatic, not a confrontation. Just 13 years of building something that no one in my family understood until the moment their lawyer called and said, your sister is the most qualified person I could find. That was enough. It has always been enough. It just needed the right phone call to become visible. There is something that happened after the dinner that I want to tell you because it completes the picture in a way the dinner alone does not. About 2 weeks after we had dinner, Melissa called me on a Sunday afternoon. Not about the case, it was over and there was nothing left to discuss professionally. She called the way she had started calling since the verdict, with a different quality than before, the quality of someone who has decided to actually pay attention. She said, I told Greg about the case, about your testimony, about what Richard said. I said, what did Greg say? She said, he said he didn't know you did that kind of work. I said, most people don't. She said, he said he always thought you were in academia. I said, I am in academia. It's not mutually exclusive with the expert witness work. She said, he said that's interesting. He said his company had a financial dispute a few years ago and they ended up settling because they couldn't find an expert who understood the specific technical issues. I said, what kind of dispute? She said, something with a supplier, alleged overcharging across several years. The number. I said, that's exactly the kind of matter forensic accounting addresses. She said, I told him that. She said, Caroline. I said, yes. She said, I've been thinking about what you said, about people not understanding specialized fields until they need them. I said, yes. She said, I think I actively didn't want to understand yours. I said, why? She said, because understanding it would have required me to admit that my assessment at 27 was wrong. And I was 27 and I had just been promoted and I thought I understood how careers worked. I said, you understood how your career worked. She said, I thought that generalized. I said, it doesn't always. She said, I know that now. She said, I've been reading your article. I said, Melissa. She said, I've been reading them, not all of them. Some of them are very technical and I don't have the background to follow the methodology, but the introductions and the conclusions. I've been reading those. I said, what are you getting from them? She said, I'm getting a sense of what the field is, what the questions are, what you've been contributing to those questions for 13 years. She said, one of them, the one about algorithmic pricing and financial statement fraud, that's directly relevant to what happened to our company. I said, yes, that's partly why Richard called me first. She said, you published research that was directly relevant to my company. Before my company had the problem, I said, the research came first. The application followed. She said, that's what research does. I said, yes. She said, I didn't know that's what research does. I thought it was abstract. I said, some of it is abstract. Some of it becomes very concrete when someone's company gets sued, she said, or when someone's company needs an expert witness. I said, yes. She said, Caroline, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, at 24. When I said it was pointless, did you think I might be right? I thought about this honestly. I said, no. She said, not even a little. I said, not about whether the field had value. I knew it had value. I had done the research. She said, like you told me to be realistic at 24. I said, I was realistic. I knew what the field was, who needed it, what the demand looked like, what a career and it could produce. You called it pointless before doing any of that research. She said, you were more realistic at 24 than I gave you credit for. I said, yes. She said, I gave you very little credit. I said, you gave me none specifically. She laughed. I laughed. She said, I'm going to keep reading the articles. I said, you don't have to. She said, I want to understand what you've spent 13 years building. Not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because it's actually interesting. I said, it is interesting. Once you get past the technical barrier, she said, the introduction and conclusion method is working for me. I said, that's how most non-specialists approach academic literature. She said, good, I'll continue. She has continued. She calls once a week now, not always about the articles, but the articles come up. She asks questions that have become more sophisticated as the weeks have passed. The questions of someone who is building a framework for understanding something unfamiliar and who is bringing real effort to the building. She told me last month that she had recommended me to a colleague whose company was facing a similar dispute. She said, I told him you were one of 4 people in the country who could handle what he needed. I said, did you know if that was accurate? She said, I called Richard Hartwell to check. She said he confirmed it. She said, I wanted to be accurate when I recommended you. I didn't want to just say my sister is good. I wanted to know. I said, that's very you. She said, is that a compliment? I said, yes. She said, good. She said, Caroline. I said, yes. She said, I'm glad you went to Georgia Tech. I said, so am I. She said, I'm glad you spent 5 years on the PhD that nobody knew what to do with. I said. She said, lawyers knew. I said, and federal investigators. She said, and federal investigator. I said, in the Department of Justice. She said, in the Department of Justice. She said, in your sister's company when it really needed someone. I said, in my sister's company. She said, which means it wasn't pointless. I said, no, it wasn't pointless. She said, I was wrong. I said, yes. She said, I should have said that 13 years ago. I said, you're saying it now. She said, is that enough? I said, it's what we have, and it's enough. She said, better late. I said, yes, better late. I am 37 years old. I have a forensic accounting practice that is exactly what I told my sister it would be when I was 24. 31 articles, 47 cases, 2 DOJ engagements. One sister who called it pointless and is now reading my introductions and conclusions and checking with Richard Hartwell before she refers me to colleagues. She said it was. Her lawyer called me because I was one of 4 people in the country who could help her. She reads my articles now. That is the complete story. That is enough. That has always been enough. It just needed 13 years and 1 phone call from Hartwell and Associates to become visible to the one person whose opinion I had stopped needing but had never stopped noticing. Better late. Considerably better than the alternative.